It's Derek Taylor again, professor for HIST 140, America to 1877. So this week, week 4, we're on to the section, the module, which is Growth, Diversity, and Conflict, 1720 to 1765. And we're covering this week a period in history of the American colonies, in which they come of age, politically and culturally speaking, in which Americans, as you kind of got from the essay you read last week by T.H. Breen, the excerpts on Worlds of Goods, in which American consumers become more and more a part of the British imperial system, begin buying more and more British goods over time, growing even indebted to British creditors as a result. Buying English clothing, buying British, newspapers, importing British, political ideas, political thought, styles of thought, building, architectural styles closer to Great Britain, and in short, the colonies are becoming more British as the 18th century wears on. And therefore, and this is the key point, more like each other than they had been. They've been kind of had their own sort of localized traditions. Well, they've become more and more like each other as they become more and more like the mother country over the period of the 18th century, which is part of this cultural and economic shift, which sees something that your textbook refers to as a consumer revolution, by which you have the consumers exerting more purchase power in the colonies, meaning you're going to have possibilities of social change you hadn't had before over the course of the 18th century in the colonies. And yet also, as it becomes more British, economically speaking, there's the possibility that it will become socially speaking more like Britain. If we're going to see, you read in the chapter, by the end of the beginning of the 1760s, there's a real possibility that you could have the development of something like a British proprietary landowning class in the colonies, in the northeastern colonies like New York and New Jersey, and definitely, of course, in the southern colonies, where they almost become sort of like hereditary nobility. And there's a sort of land crunch where these people are buying up a lot of the land, making small farmers have to push west to the boundaries of the colonies, and of course into Indian territory, which will cause problems, as we'll see. And so all this growth leads to these sorts of problems in the 18th century, but also to the emergence of, again, like I said, a slightly newer, more unified sense of colonial society in the 18th century. And so you get a preview of what you haven't had yet in the textbook, the society of the northern colonies, how it differs from that of the southern colonies, as well as the middle colonies, the colonies in the sort of middle Atlantic, Pennsylvania, Delaware, places like this, in which they will talk about the cultural diversity, different types of immigrants groups coming to places like Pennsylvania, Delaware, places like that, Scotch Presbyterians from Scotland, German immigrants, people like this, Quakers, of course, who run Pennsylvania colony, and bring in sort of an element of religious and ethnic diversity to the American colony, which for the most part in European terms are still for the most part Anglophone. They're mostly Scottish, mostly English, few Irish, but they're predominantly a British colony anyway, but still more of this as the century goes along. And then secondly, of course, you're going to have this great cultural coming of age as well, which basically two big things mark out the period for the 18th century colonies. The first is the arrival of the ideals of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, to the colonies over the course of the 18th century. We have the Enlightenment, which your textbook defines as being defined by four principles. One's a reliance on the order of the natural world. The second is human reason. The third is the principle of natural rights for individuals. And then four, an idea of progress, progressively improving human society. And this begins, most textbooks state, in the 17th century. You have thinkers like René Descartes and John Locke advocating certain of these principles. I won't go into this too much detail there. You'll get it from the textbook. The biggest and most important of these figures for the colonists is John Locke. He, of course, is English. They imbibe his philosophy. He's a philosopher. He's also a political philosopher. His work, The Two Treatises of Government, will be very important for the founders of the American Republic. However, the two texts that are actually more important for colonists in the 18th century are his major work of philosophy, an essay concerning human understanding, which describes a sort of empiricist way of understanding knowledge, like how you know things. through experience, through sense and through your senses and reflection on your sensory experience, as opposed to principles of abstract rationality or dogmatic authority or something like that, as well as his a little work he wrote called Thoughts Concerning Education. He was very influential in terms of the educational apparatus of many of the 18th century colonies. His two treatises, his major political work, really wasn't widely read in the colonies until the 1770s for reasons that become obvious as we go forward. But these Enlightenment ideals become instantiated in colonial society by the 1770s. You're going to have institutions of learning, like the American Philosophical Society, which is founded in the 1770s by Benjamin Franklin, who's kind of the sort of exemplar of Enlightenment thinking in the colonies himself. He becomes sort of a celebrity across the Atlantic, in Britain and in France, for his inventions. Remember, he invents all sorts of things, does Benjamin Franklin. Founds newspapers, writes Poor Richard's Almanac, which is this famous book advocating self-help and self-improvement. Invents things like bifocals and so on and so forth. And so you'll have this layer of ideals, which is dedicated to, you might call, secular inquiry into the nature of the world, added on to a society in the colony which is for the most part very religious, and for the most part reliant on what you might call, traditions of learning or folk wisdom or something like this. Even at the same time, it does, as it becomes part of this empire-wide system, it imbibes some of those same ideals, especially in the Northeast. That's where a lot of this stuff will center on. The other major factor in, and by the way, I should mention as well, when I talk about Anglicization, you should talk about the consumption of British ideals, political ideals from the Enlightenment being part of that. The other major transformation that leads to a cultural coming of age for the colonies is what's called the Great Awakening. This is a series of religious revivals which start out in New England in the 1740s and which spread gradually from the 1750s and 1760s down through to the southern colonies. And what these revivals mean basically is there's a big change in Western Protestant Christianity starting in the 18th century in places like Germany, and then later on the 1730s in England, in which you have people, this equivalent of this is called Pietism in Germany, and there are Protestants who gain the conviction that you have to have this intense emotional experience, where you experience an emotional connection with the deity, with God or whatever, which is the true experience of religion, basically. It puts a lot of emphasis on personal conversion. Having that sort of personal experience was very emotional. In which in the 1730s in England and Britain is exemplified by John Wesley, the great founder of Methodism, the Methodist Church, which won't emerge until after his death in the 1790s. But he's a member of the clergy of the Church of England, and he has this intense personal experience where he really feels like Jesus Christ is his Savior. He's been saved from damnation, and his goal is to go around preaching, getting people to have the same sort of sense of conversion. Otherwise, it means you won't be saved because you won't have your heart or whatever transformed. And so you have this emotional, personal, experience-driven form of Christianity coming to loggerheads with some of the establishment, both in England, but also in the colonies, because some of Wesley's preachers, particularly a man named George Whitefield, goes to the colonies and spreads this sort of ideal there, which is always welcomed in certain places, because it's hard for us to remember now, but religion prior to the 18th century, for the most part, was, yes, there were emotive aspects to it, devotions and prayers and those sorts of things, but it was there's much less emphasis on that. The emphasis was on having the right belief, on being orthodox in a sort of intellectual sense. Again, I'm not saying emotion didn't play into it, but it was much more considered to be more important to have a right knowledge of a right belief than it was to have the right experience. And that's what Whitefield and these preachers bring, which causes upheavals both in the Northeast. You're going to have some preachers being banned from certain places in the Northeast. And you're going to have, as this gets into the South, it'll sort of challenge. And I should mention, by the way, the religious background when we talk about the 18th century. The 18th century colonies, pretty much all of them have, with the exception of, I believe, Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, they have religious freedom in both of those colonies. All of them have established churches, that is to say, official government state-run churches, which are the dominant church there, even if they allow and they do mostly allow other religious bodies, religious denominations, mostly Protestant. There's a few Jews, there are a few Roman Catholics here and there in the port cities of the colonies. For the most part, it's a Protestant set of colonies. Both immigration from Scotland and Germany sort of breaks us up a little bit with the influence of Lutheranism and Presbyterianism. But in general, the colonies, and you do have, and I should mention this background here, it's maybe kind of confusing. In Britain, in the United Kingdom, you have a state-established church as well, called the Church of England, which is the church that basically everybody has to belong to if they want to vote or hold political office. And for the most part in the 18th century, it's predominant. But you had, going back to the 17th century, religious bodies that had rejected the church-state settlement that was sort of put in place after the Civil Wars were over in the 1660s. And they formed their own, what were sometimes called dissenting churches of various types. This is where our Puritan fathers come from in New England, the so-called, sometimes called the Congregationalist Church. Presbyterians, mostly from Scotland. That's where they have a Presbyterian church, state church there. Of course, you have Lutherans coming from Germany. You also have the Quakers. They're a dissenting body that come from England. And my point with mentioning all this is that you have other groups that will emerge in the 1760s in the Americas. Baptists, who are sort of localist, don't really have a large apparatus. Their understanding of church is it's a local body of believers, and that's it for the most part. Is that it's a plethora of religious bodies who are all Protestant, but they're almost defined in some ways by their rejection of the state-run church, which of course has its own branches in the southern colonies like the Carolinas and Virginia, where it's established there by state law. So you have this mixture of Protestant dominations, but there's kind of rivalry between them. And this Great Awakening will sort of exacerbate this in the years leading up to 1760, to the 1760s. And so finally, and again, that's going to be, and again, you could see this, by the way, this religious distinction being a key dividing line between the colonies and the mother country. I talked about, Anglicization, them becoming more and more like Britain. One way they never did was they never became too much like them in religious terms, because they had this, if you like, more dissenting form of Christianity as opposed to, the ideal of a single state-run church. So these are sort of separate colonies and separate states in their own right. But that's the general background. And the Great Awakening begins to kind of challenge these sorts of things. Because, of course, if your authority doesn't come from being part of the right church, but from having the right personal experience, well, that's a kind of challenge to that, basically. Which brings me finally to the last thing you're going to read in the chapter. The thing that's going to begin to sort of break all this up and sort of, not break it all up, but disrupt, if you like, the sort of course of changes that are going throughout the colonies in the 18th century, is the Great War for Empire, as your textbook calls it rightly. The 7 Years' War, as it's called in Europe, because there's a big conflict between the French and their allies and the British and their allies on the continent, which is fought in North America. It actually starts in North America between the French and the British with their Indian allies, which we call the French and Indian War. The Indians, of course, are being increasingly pushed west by settlers pushing into their territories because they want more land. And they kind of, after a certain point, I'm generalizing, see that they have to choose sides. Some choose the British, some choose the French. A war starts in the 1750s with George Washington. You'll see he's involved in this, which leads to a major conflict in 1754, which I'm going to summarize for you. You can read the events in the book yourself. Ends with the defeat of the British. This is the major outcome of the war. Excuse me, the defeat of the French, I should say, by the British. Who essentially kick the French out of North America altogether. They had controlled large swaths of territory. They take Canada from the French. The French still have some islands in the Caribbean, but for the most part, they're done away with in North America. They're also, by the way, and this is part of the larger theater of this war, they defeat them in Europe, or at least hold them a stalemate there, and they kick them out of India as well. So Britain emerges from this war as the greatest power in Europe, imperially speaking, but also economically speaking. And so it doesn't just change the balance of power in the colonies, it changes the balance of power in Europe and therefore in the world. So this changes things on a global scale, both for the United Kingdom itself, but also for its colonies in the 18th century, because it's going to necessarily change the relationship between what the colonies expect from their mother government and from what the central government back in London expects from those colonies. And you'll see what this is coming in the next chapter. It'll lead, of course, into the American Revolution. And so, yeah, and so that's the sort of narrative we give you for this week. In terms of sources, I'll mention this I mentioned this in an email for you. This week, no readings from Major Problems. I have a couple of sources for you to read, posted as a PDF file on the module for this week. Should say something like British Empire docs. And what they are two plans for colonial union written in the 18th century. They're plans for the political unification of all the colonies under the headship of one central parliament, basically, in North America. The first was written by a man named Martin Bladen, who was a minister of the Crown, the British Crown, who wrote this plan for union in 1739 when the British government was at war with Spain. There had been some conflicts in the Caribbean, the Spanish had colonies there, and they were fighting a war, and Martin Bladen wanted to provide for the defense of the colonies against possible Spanish or French aggression. And so he comes up with a fairly long, I think it's about 8 or 9 pages in the PDF, I think it may be excerpted, plan for union, which he details how it might come about and what some of the problems might be. What problems might there be, imposing a single settlement on all these disparate colonies who are all very jealous of their own individual rights and prerogatives. So it's an interesting thing to read, along with a much shorter plan for union promulgated by Benjamin Franklin in 1755, during the middle of the French and Indian Wars, about 16 years later. And both of these are interesting because, of course, they presume, something about the colony's place in the British Empire and what their purpose is vis-a-vis, the mother government, the central government in Britain. And you should take a notice, by the way, of the differences between them, similarities as well. But of course, right off the bat, you see Martin Bladen's. He's a British official, whereas Benjamin Franklin's, of course, from the colonies. And so they see things a little bit different. But for the most part, you'll see a lot of similarities. Which brings me, of course, finally to the last thing we're going to write on this for this week. A couple of things. This is about midway point, not midway point, but the first 4-week point, about quarter way point through the semester by the end of this week. And I urge you to look at, if you have not already, to look at the midterm question. Again, you should be taking a look at this every week and looking through what the question entails, right? It's going to be about identity, right? How it develops by the early 1800s, because we haven't got to the American Republic yet, but when we get there, you're going to need to look over long-term developments in America before you get to that point. And take a look at these sources in light of that. How were people already beginning to think of these colonies, not just disparate colonies, but maybe one single union, one single country? Because, of course, we're still arguing about that in the early 1800s. How are we one nation? But how these things in this colonial period maybe flow into that in the long run. Keep that in mind. Again, always have that in front of you when you're reading this stuff. That can be helpful for you when you get to that point. And then finally, this is the first 4-week period, quarter, if you like, session of the course is over with. And that means on the module for this week, you'll have a forum for feedback, which you're required to give. All you have to do is give, 1 or 2 suggestions about the course for me. And just a couple of tips on this. I've mentioned this in the email as well, but try to be constructive. A lot of you, by the way, have done great with emailing me about questions, and I mean about anything. You have done great with that. Email me about anything, quizzes, the discussions, anything. Start emailing me, by the way, about the midterm as soon as you can. Take a look at it. But in terms of your feedback, just again, 1 or 2 types of things. Either tell me what's not working and ask about it. Or 2, tell me what's working and, tell me that works for you. Any sort of feedback will be very helpful for me. I really am trying to make the course better for you as I go along and not wait till next semester to sort of correct things that I may be not doing as well this semester. And I tell you, it's very helpful when it's constructive, very helpful. Makes me a better professor, makes my employers want to keep me employed. That's always great to have some money. And it's part of your grade. It's not a big part of your grade. It's a small part. I guess you can get away with not doing it, but it's nothing. Just think about something that's working for you, why it's working, help me out a little bit. Or again, constructively, do it politely. Don't say, you're the worst professor. No, and nobody's done that so far. You guys have been great, like I said, by emailing me with your concerns. Do some of that this week. Leave a couple of posts. And that'll be it for this week. So on this week, to the sort of build up building up to the dramatic, it's very dramatic, the American Revolution and its aftermath, with the sort of build up, the ramp up toward that, as the colonies grow into this much more unified entity in the 18th century. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Hope you guys have a great week. Take care, and I'll be in contact with you throughout the week. Bye.